Britain, 1940. The summer air carried more than warmth, it carried fear. Sirens wailed across London as the sky filled with the dark wings of German bombers. The Battle of Britain had begun, and the island stood alone. Every morning, black smoke rose from the ruins of cities that had been whole the day before. The Royal Air Force was fighting with everything it had, but everything was not enough. Planes were burning faster than they could be built. Pilots were dying faster than they could be trained. The nation's lifeline, its air power, was collapsing. And yet, in a small, forgotten factory on the outskirts of Southampton, one man, a quiet engineer named R.J. Mitchell, was fighting his own war. Not with bullets or bombs, but with blueprints, broken engines, and sleepless nights. He was dying of cancer, but he refused to stop working because he knew if his design failed, Britain would fall. And so when hope was gone, when the skies seemed lost, this dying man gave Britain wings. Years before the bombs began to fall, before the Spitfire became a symbol of British defiance, R.J. Mitchell was just an engineer in overalls, a man obsessed with speed. He worked for the Supermarine Aviation Company, building sleek racing seaplanes for international contests. To him, aircraft weren't machines. They were living creatures. He shaped their wings as though sculpting muscle and bone, chasing perfection through air resistance and thrust. His Supermarine S-6B seaplane would one day shatter the world speed record, flying faster than any aircraft in history at that time. It was a victory that few noticed beyond the front pages. But for Mitchell, it was a test, a step towards something greater. When others saw racing trophies, Mitchell saw war clouds. The 1930s were trembling under the weight of Germany's rearmament. In the airfields of Bavaria, new Luftwaffe squadrons were rising. Fast, agile, deadly. Britain's RAF, meanwhile, was flying outdated biplanes that still looked like relics of the First World War. Mitchell knew what was coming. He'd studied the German designs, the speed, the precision. He told his team, if war comes, we'll need something faster, something sharper. His words were quiet but certain, and in that small design office filled with cigarette smoke and the hum of drafting pencils, he began to draw the first lines of what would become the most legendary fighter in British history, the Supermarine Spitfire. But genius is never born in peace. The company's board doubted him. The Air Ministry wanted safer, slower designs, planes that fit bureaucratic checklists instead of pilot instincts. Mitchell clashed with officials, with his own superiors, even with his own body. He was diagnosed with cancer, and the doctors warned him to stop working. He didn't. To him, rest meant surrender. Every night, he'd return to his blueprints, coughing blood into a handkerchief, his pencil trembling, but never pausing. He told his assistant, if I can't fly, I'll give others the wings to do it. Outside, the world grew darker. News from Europe was grim. Nations were falling one by one. Hitler's armies were moving like storms, unstoppable, merciless. Mitchell's workshop became a bunker of purpose. His team called him the Chief, and even as his body weakened, his vision grew stronger. He spoke not of glory or recognition, but of necessity. It must be fast enough to chase them, he said, strong enough to turn tighter, beautiful enough to lift our spirits. The Spitfire was not just a plane, it was a promise. By 1936, the prototype took flight. It sliced through the sky like a silver arrow, its wings curved and elegant, its engine roaring with life. The test pilots landed, breathless, calling it the most magnificent machine ever built. But Mitchell didn't celebrate. He watched from the runway, a scarf around his neck, eyes tired and distant. He knew what no one else did. He wouldn't live to see what this plane would mean for Britain. His cancer was spreading. Still, he worked through his final days, adjusting, refining, perfecting the machine that might outlive him. When he died in 1937, few outside the aviation world noticed. There was no parade, no headline tribute, just a quiet funeral for a quiet man. But 2 years later, when the Luftwaffe filled Britain's skies, the RAF took off in his creation, the Spitfire. It climbed into history, its engines screaming the sound of defiance. And somewhere in the roar of every flight, you could still hear the echo of Mitchell's final words. If Britain is to live, she must first fly. Summer 1940, the skies over England had turned into a battlefield. From dawn until dusk, the air trembled with the thunder of engines, the low, rising growl of German bombers, and the piercing scream of fighters diving through smoke. Every few minutes, another alarm blared. Civilians ran for shelters as the air filled with the metallic scent of burning steel and gasoline. Britain was being bombed into submission. The Luftwaffe's goal was simple: destroy the RAF, cripple the nation's will, and clear the way for invasion. And yet, through the case, the Spitfire finally spread its wings. The first time the Spitfire met the enemy in full force, the pilots didn't quite believe what they were flying. Its controls were lighter, more responsive. The plane seemed to sense their thoughts before their hands could move. One pilot would later say, "She was alive, more than a machine. She wanted to fly. She wanted to fight." Against the formidable German Messerschmitt F-109, the Spitfire didn't just compete. It danced, its elliptical wings cut through the air with grace, its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine howling like a beast awakened. For the first time, the RAF could look the Luftwaffe in the eye and fight back on equal terms. But victory never came easily. The pilots were young, many barely 20 years old, drawn from farms, factories, and schools. They trained in the rain, often sleeping beside their aircraft on cold airfields. They had only minutes of combat experience before being thrown into battle. The Luftwaffe outnumbered them nearly 2-1. Every morning, the squadrons lined up for briefings, studying maps littered with red arrows pushing toward the heart of England. Every night, fewer men returned than had taken off. Behind every glorious photograph of a smiling pilot stood the empty bunk of a friend who didn't come back. Still, the Spitfire became their armor and their faith. Its curves caught the sunlight like a blade, its engine roared like defiance. It could climb faster than the German fighters, turn sharper, and recover from dives that should have torn its wings apart. The Luftwaffe began to fear its silhouette, that slender, lethal shape glinting in the clouds. Radio chatter among German pilots spoke of it like a ghost. "A British devil," one said. "You see it only for a moment, then you're dead." In the control rooms of Fighter Command, Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding watched the radar screens flicker with incoming swarm. Every decision meant lives. Every delay meant cities burning. Yet through it all, the Spitfire squadrons, alongside the rugged Hurricanes, rose again and again. They were exhausted, undersupplied, often flying 3 or 4 missions a day. Mechanics slept under the wings, patching holes with tin and prayer. Ground crews worked through the night to keep the planes flying, their faces blackened with oil and smoke. Each morning as the sun rose over the airfields, rows of Spitfires gleamed like silver guardians ready for battle. It wasn't just a plane anymore. It was a symbol, a weapon forged not only from metal, but from belief. And as the Luftwaffe's raids intensified, the people of Britain began to cling to the sight of it. Children pointed to the skies shouting, "Our boys are up there." Newspapers printed photographs of Spitfires streaking above the white cliffs of Dover. It became the face of resistance, the sound of survival. When London burned, the roar of the Spitfire was the sound that said, "We are still here," but the cost was unbearable. Entire squadrons were wiped out. Villages lost sons in a single day. The pilots, called the Few by Winston Churchill, carried not just the defense of Britain, but the weight of its hope. In their hands, Mitchell's machine became the last line between freedom and darkness. And yet, even as they fought with courage beyond measure, the outcome still hung by a thread: fuel was running low. The pilots were reaching their breaking point. The Luftwaffe was preparing for one final massive assault, a wave meant to crush the RAF once and for all. Britain's survival would depend on whether the Spitfire could endure what was coming next. The storm was far from over. The real test, the day that would decide the fate of a nation, was still ahead. September 15th, 1940. Dawn broke over England with a cold stillness that felt unnatural, as if the world itself were holding its breath. The radar stations along the southern coast began to hum with warnings. Blips appeared on the screens. Dozens, then hundreds. The Luftwaffe was coming, not in scattered raids this time, but as an armada. Nearly 1,500 German aircraft, bombers, escorts, fighters, stretched across the channel like a moving storm for the men of the ERAF. This was it, the battle that would decide not just the war, but whether Britain would survive at all. At the airfields, pilots scrambled before their breakfast had even cooled. Engines coughed to life, sending plumes of smoke across the dew-soaked grass. The air reeked of fuel and fear. Ground crews waved them off with oil-stained hands, many silently wondering if they'd ever see those boys again. The sky above southern England began to throb with the sound of engines. The low growl of hurricanes, the sharper, almost defiant snarl of Spitfires. As they climbed higher, the sun glinted off their wings, turning them into fleeting flashes of silver in a sea of gray. The first contact came just after 11 a.m. German bombers, escorted by sleek Messerschmitts, broke through the clouds in perfect formation. The sky erupted. Trails of white vapor streaked across the heavens as fighters dove and twisted in a deadly ballet. Tracers burned like sparks in the air. The roar of engines was deafening, a mechanical storm where human voices were swallowed by chaos. From the ground, civilians looked up and saw their skies aflame. The Battle of Britain had reached its breaking point. In the cockpit of a Spitfire, the world was a blur of motion and instinct. The stick jerked in trembling hands. Sweat stung the eyes and oxygen hissed through the mask. One pilot described it as flying inside a hurricane of steel. The enemy could appear from anywhere, above, below, behind. Every second demanded a decision. Every hesitation meant death. Many never saw the shot that ended them. Those who survived often landed trembling, their fuel tanks dry, their bullet holes patched with adrenaline and luck. Over the radio, the voice of command was calm, precise. Squadron 603, intercept at Dover. 609, vector south, Angels 20. But behind those clipped words lay desperation. There were no reserves left. Every available pilot, even the exhausted and injured, was sent up. Airfields were bombed as soon as planes landed, forcing mechanics to drag wrecks off the runways. While new fighters tried to take off through the smoke, Britain was fighting with everything it had and running out of time. As the battle raged, something shifted. The Luftwaffe expected Britain to break, but the Spitfires did not yield. Again and again, they rose from the clouds, attacking with fury that defied exhaustion. German bombers began to falter under the relentless assault. Pilots who thought the RAF had been crushed found themselves surrounded by British fighters emerging like ghosts from the sun. The invincible Luftwaffe was bleeding, and the myth of German air supremacy was dying in the smoke. By late afternoon, the tide had turned. The German formations scattered, many dropping their bombs early to lighten their escape. The RAF, battered but unbroken, chased them across the channel until the sea itself shimmered with the wreckage of fallen planes. That evening, as the sun sank over London's shattered skyline, the air finally fell silent. For the first time in months, Britain stood undefeated. The invasion Hitler had promised, Operation Sea Lion, was postponed indefinitely. The island had survived the greatest onslaught ever launched against its skies, and at the center of it all was the Spitfire, a machine that should never have existed, designed by a man who never lived to see its triumph. That day would be remembered as Battle of Britain Day, a moment when courage outflew fear, when engineering genius met human determination. But for the men who fought it, it wasn't a legend. It was hours of fire, noise, and terror. And when they landed, many simply sat beside their aircraft, too numb to speak, staring at the holes in the wings that had carried them home. The battle had been won, but the war and the price of that victory was far from over. The morning after the great battle, England awoke to a silence that felt almost sacred. The airfields, once roaring with engines, now stood littered with the remains of what had been sacrificed to keep the skies free. Burned-out wrecks lined the grass, Spitfires with their wings torn open, hurricanes riddled with bullet holes, the ground beneath them stained with oil, fuel, and blood. Mechanics moved quietly among the debris, some carrying helmets that would never be worn again. Victory had come, yes, but it had been bought with the lives of boys barely old enough to shave. And inside a small office at Supermarine, the mood was equally somber. The factory had survived the raids, but the man who had given Britain its greatest weapon, Reginald J. Mitchell, was long gone. He had died 4 years earlier, in 1937, of cancer. He never lived to see the machine he dreamed of save his country. The men who worked beside him remembered his final words before he passed. "If ever this machine saves Britain, you'll know why I fought so hard for it." Those words echoed now like prophecy. The Spitfire had not just saved a nation, it had defined its courage. Mitchell had been a quiet man, modest to the point of invisibility. He wasn't a soldier or a politician. He never fired a gun, never stood on a battlefield. But his war had been fought in the hangars, on drawing boards, against deadlines and doubts when others told him his elliptical wing design was too radical, too expensive, too impractical. He refused to give up. "Speed is the essence of war," he used to say, "and beauty is its servant." He built something not only fast, but graceful. The Spitfire wasn't just an aircraft, but it was a statement of defiance in aluminum and fire. Now, as Britain buried its young pilots, that defiance became a symbol. Children who had huddled in bomb shelters began drawing Spitfires on scraps of paper. Women who built the planes in factories cried quietly when they read the casualty lists, yet returned to work the next day without complaint. The Spitfire had given Britain something priceless. Hope, a fragile, winged reminder that even in the darkest storm, the spirit of creation could stand against destruction. In London, Churchill gave his famous speech to Parliament. "Never in the field of human conflict, was so much owed by so many to so few." The few were the pilots, brave, reckless, unyielding. But those who truly understood the battle knew that behind every pilot stood 1,000 unseen hands. The designers, the welders, the factory women, the draftsmen bent over blueprints through sleepless nights. All of them carried Mitchell's vision forward. They were the silent army behind the skies. The cost of victory was not only measured in lives but in exhaustion. Britain's factories ran night and day under blackout curtains, the workers surviving on tea and rationed bread. Bombers still came, but each raid was met with the shriek of Spitfire engines climbing to intercept. The aircraft's design evolved, improved, adapted. Faster engines, stronger frames, longer range. It became a living machine, growing with the war itself. And though Mitchell was gone, his fingerprints remained on every curve, every rivet. The Spitfire's legend began to spread beyond Britain. In France, Poland, and later the United States, pilots spoke of it in awe. "It's the plane that dances," one said. "It feels éléphant." To fly it was to feel the mind of its maker, a man who had fused mathematics and emotion into flight. Every time a Spitfire streaked through the clouds, it was as if Mitchell's spirit rose with it, defying gravity and fear alike. But behind the pride, there was a haunting question that lingered in the hearts of those who knew his story. Would he have believed it worth it? Would the quiet man from Staffordshire, who designed planes for peace, not war, have found comfort in knowing his creation became both a weapon and a symbol? No one could answer that, yet those who fought believed one thing with certainty. Without Reginald Mitchell, there would have been no few left to save. And so the cost of victory was not just paid in lives lost or machines destroyed, but in the quiet sacrifice of a man who had given everything, even his life, to give his country wings. Years after the Battle of Britain, when the smoke had cleared and Europe had begun to rebuild, the Spitfire still ruled the skies, not as a weapon, but as a symbol. It became the sound of freedom itself, that smooth hum of a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine echoing across quiet English fields that had once been battle zones. Farmers stopped their work to watch it pass overhead. Elderly men stood in silence, and children pointed upward, not knowing the full story of the machine that had saved their world. But those who lived through those desperate days, they remembered. They remembered the fear, the nights when London burned under the Blitz, when the sky was alive with flames. They remembered the young pilots, faces pale under leather helmets, climbing into cockpits knowing they might not return. And they remembered the name whispered among engineers, the man who never saw his creation in victory, Reginald Joseph Mitchell, the forgotten hero whose genius gave wings to hope when all else seemed lost. He had built not just a plane, but a promise, that courage and imagination could stand against tyranny. In the post-war years, the Spitfire was retired, its aluminum skin fading under the sun, its once proud frame stored in museums and airfields. Yet even as time wore it down, the legend refused to die. Each surviving aircraft became a relic of something deeper. Not war itself, but the human spirit's refusal to break. Every rivet, every curve, was a story of hands that worked in darkness so the world might see light again. The Spitfire was never meant to be a monument, yet it became one, carved not in stone, but in speed and sky. When modern engineers study its design, they still marvel. The elliptical wings, the lightness of frame, the precision of aerodynamics, ahead of its time, born of sleepless nights and sketches on scraps of paper. Mitchell had once said he wanted to make something perfect, and perhaps, in his quiet, unspoken way, he did. He gave Britain not just an aircraft, but an idea that beauty and purpose could coexist, even in war, that in the face of despair, creation itself could become resistance, and there, in that truth lies the heart of his legacy, because history often remembers the loud, the generals, the speeches, the victories. But the world was saved too by the quiet, by those who dreamed behind blueprints, who shaped steel and stone, air with trembling hands. Mitchell's story is a reminder that even the smallest acts of creation can echo louder than destruction. That sometimes the most powerful weapon is not a gun or a bomb, but an idea made real today. When a Spitfire takes flight over the English countryside, its wings glinting in the pale sunlight, it carries more than history. It carries memory. The spirit of a man who fought his own war with pencil and paper, who saw beyond death to design life. It carries the voices of the men who flew it, the women who built it, the children who prayed beneath it. And as it cuts through the clouds, it whispers to the generations that follow. Courage is not the absence of fears, it's the choice to build when the world is burning. The forgotten hero gave Britain wings when hope was lost. And in doing so, he gave the world proof that even in its darkest hour, humanity's light could still rise and fly.